before we get started in the text this evening, if you want to go ahead and turn to 1 Kings 3, we'll go through the outlines of the books as we have each week. 1 Kings, we've outlined 1st and 2nd Kings together. The first 11 chapters of 1 King is the reign of Solomon. Then beginning in chapter 12, we say going on through 17 of 2 Kings, is going to be the period of the divided kingdom, and then you'll have the fall of Israel and Judah recorded in 2 Kings 18 through 2 Kings 25 through the close of the book. There, so we have the reign of Solomon. That's the end of the United Kingdom in 1 through 11, the divided kingdom 1 Kings 12 through 2 Kings 17, and then the falls of Israel and Judah in 18 to 25. We're finishing up 1 Chronicles this evening, so we'll look at the outline one more time for it. 1 Chronicles, we divided into two sections. It's the genealogies in 1 to 9, and it's the reign of David 10 through 29. And then we're beginning 2 Chronicles this evening, and so we want to introduce the outline for 2 Chronicles. It as well divides into two major sections. 1 through 9 is the reign of Solomon in 2 Chronicles 1 to 9, and then 10 through 36 is the kings of Judah during the divided kingdom. The book of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, is going to focus on Judah, and we'll mention Israel as they come in contact with Judah when we get to the divided kingdom beginning in chapter 10. So we're focusing in 2 Chronicles on the kings of Judah, the line of David, and then we'll mention Israel as they're brought in, as they come in contact with the southern kingdom of Judah. And so that's why we're focusing on the kings of Judah during the divided kingdom in 10 through 36. We're in 1 Kings chapter 3. We'll cover 3 and 4, and then 2 Chronicles 28, 29, or 1 Chronicles 28, 29, and 2 Chronicles 1. 1 Kings chapter 3 is probably one of the more familiar stories to us, or two of the more familiar stories, rather, in the life of Solomon. The first 15 verses are going to be Solomon asking for wisdom, and then we'll see the story of him using his wisdom in 16 to 28. Beginning at verse 1, we'll read 1 through 5. Then Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were still sacrificing on the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. In Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, "Ask what you wish me to give you." We'll pick up at verse 6 in just a moment. But here, verse 1 is talking about him forming this marriage alliance with Pharaoh. He marries Pharaoh's daughter. But beginning at verse 2, it talks about and focuses in on this key here in 2 through 15. At that time, there was the house of the Lord had not been built yet. The temple has not been built. So where did Solomon go, and where did people often go at this point to offer worship? Where are they heading to? Gibeon, to the high places. There are these high places, and it says that in Gibeon was this great high place. In verse 4, that they went to Gibeon, for that was the great high place. And so Solomon goes there to offer burnt offerings to the Lord. So he comes there to Gibeon to sacrifice to the Lord. But in verse 5, the Lord says to Solomon, "Ask what you wish me to give you." So here, if you will, Solomon sort of has a blank check handed to him and says, "Ask for whatever you want, and I'm going to give it to you. Just go ahead and ask, and it will be yours." Now you can imagine for just a moment, and this is going to be brought up later on by the Lord, that a lot of people at this point handed a blank check would ask for a lot of things, probably not what we're fixing to see Solomon request. So somebody was sort of handed a blank check again, if you will. They might say, "Well, I want wealth, or long life, or in the position of a king, I want rest from my enemies. I want," and they could list all these things. "Here's what I want." If that was asked of them, I think it's a second, we need to take a second as we're going through this and ask ourselves, if that opportunity was presented to me, if the Lord sort of handed me that blank check, if you will, and said, "Ask and I will give it to you," what would be my request? What would I request if I had that same opportunity that was presented here to Solomon? But let's pick up at verse 6. So Solomon has been told, "Ask what you wish me to give you." So here's what he says. Beginning in verse 6. Then Solomon said, "You have shown great loving kindness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours?" So here Solomon's handed this blank check. What would you have me to give you, Solomon? Ask what you wish me to give you. And Solomon's reply is, "Give me an understanding heart to judge your people and discern between good and evil." Solomon's request here is, "Give me wisdom." Now, we often talk about Solomon's wisdom from this point forward, and rightfully so. We'll talk about a story about Solomon's wisdom here later on in chapter 3. But I think we need to appreciate and understand the amount of wisdom he already showed in his request. That is, as Solomon here, and it says that Solomon refers to himself in verse 7 as but a little child. He's very young. He's still young as he's taken the throne. How many young people do you hand this blank check to and their reply is, "Give me wisdom"? So even before he requested wisdom, and we talk about this, Solomon shows some great wisdom at this point in even requesting that he be given the wisdom and the understanding to judge the people and to discern between good and evil. So it takes a lot of wisdom already on Solomon's part to make that request. It also takes a lot of humility on the part of Solomon to request wisdom. Because in this text, as Solomon is requesting wisdom, he has to beforehand, before he ever requests this understanding heart, Solomon is acknowledging that he needs help in ruling the people. Look again, verse 6. He talked about how he had shown loving kindness to David and reserved for him this great loving kindness, and that he gave him a son to sit on the throne. And in verse 7, "You've made your servant king in the place of my father, yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted." Here's Solomon looking at this, just saying, listen, I'm young. I need help in leading the people. I don't know how to go out or come in. Much less, how am I going to be able to lead this great nation, be able to lead this people of yours? And so it took a great deal of humility on the part of Solomon, because he had to acknowledge at this point, I need help to be able to adequately lead your people. So Solomon shows humility and he shows wisdom in his request. But look at verse 10. Here's God's reply to Solomon's request. "It was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. God said to him, because you have asked this thing and have not asked for yourself long life, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself discernment to understand justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. If you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days." Then Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered burnt offerings and made peace offerings and made a feast for all his servants. So as you look here at God's reply to Solomon, he makes the point in verse 10 that you have asked this thing, that is, you've asked for this discernment to understand justice, as he refers to it at the end of verse 11. And you haven't asked for long life or riches or peace from your enemies. You haven't asked all this other stuff. I'm going to give you your request for wisdom, but what else does he say? Right. Not only am I going to give you what you requested, I'm going to give you what you didn't request. You'll have peace from your enemies. You'll have long life. You will have riches. So here God has told him, I will grant your wish and give you these other things you did not request. Again, how many other people, young people in Solomon's position would not have turned to ask for the other things? Imagine being a ruler over Israel. How many would have turned and asked for the riches, the long life? How many would have asked for peace from their enemies? Solomon says, I don't need all that. What I need wisdom to help me to lead your people. Yes.
I think what he's saying here is he was asking for the important things in his life at this time. And God gave him other things that he wasn't asking for.
Right. He was asking for what was most important, and God gave him more. And it shouldn't be shocking to us that Solomon requested wisdom, because this is something that was instilled in him by his father David. If you remember in the book of Proverbs, as Solomon is writing to his own son, that he points out about the instruction that he had received. In Proverbs 4, he said, Hear, O sons, the discipline of a father, in verse 1, and pay attention that you may know understanding. For I give you sound learning, do not forsake my instruction. When I was a son to my father, tender and the only son before my mother, then he instructed me and said to me, Let your heart hold fast my words, keep my commandments and live. Acquire wisdom, verse 5, acquire understanding. Do not forget and do not turn away from the sayings of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is acquire wisdom, and with all your acquiring, acquire understanding. So it shouldn't shock us at this moment that as this request is given to Solomon, that Solomon doesn't turn, though many other people in his position would not have turned to request wisdom, because this is something that his father David had instilled in him. So when Solomon writes later on to his own son in Proverbs, he says, here's what my father told me that you need to learn. Get wisdom, acquire understanding. And Solomon remembered that. You imagine for a second being in Solomon's position in the request. Here you have this opportunity to make this request. And the Lord says, what would you have me to give to you? And Solomon, sitting there maybe in the back of his mind, is thinking, my father always told me, acquire wisdom and acquire understanding. That's what I'm going to do. He remembered the teaching of David. But now, not only does he remember the teaching of David, not only does he ask for wisdom and receive it, not only does he receive these other things, he receives the prolonging of days conditionally. So there's something important we see in this, here in verse 14. Promises can be conditional. Look at verse 14. If you keep or walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments, as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. So remember, in the request here, here's what you could request. You could have requested length of days. You could have requested peace from your enemies. You could have requested riches. You didn't request that. Instead, you requested to have a discerning heart. I'm going to give you this discerning to understand justice, but I'm also going to give you the riches, the length of days, and the peace from your enemies. But the prolonging or the length of days is conditional on this. You keep my commandments. There's a conditional promise that he's given here. Here's what you can have, Solomon, but this is conditional. You keep my commandments. He tells Solomon that's necessary for him to do in order to keep and to maintain these. So what he needs to do is do as his father David had done, to walk in the ways of the Lord, to keep the statutes of the Lord, to keep his commandments. Which, by the way, at this point, it's already been pointed out in verse 3, Solomon's doing that. Look at verse 3 again. Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burnt incense on the high places. He's already doing that. What he's telling him is, you keep on doing what you're already doing, and then this is what you can have. This is what you will receive. But now, Solomon has requested in these first 15 verses, it's given to him, what would you have? He asked for wisdom. Then he comes down in verse 15, and he comes to Jerusalem and stands before the Ark of the Covenant and offers burnt offerings to the Lord and peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants in verse 15. Verse 16 through the end of this chapter is Solomon uses his wisdom. He's requested wisdom. He's got this wisdom. Here's Solomon's use of it. Verse 16 beginning, Then 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, O my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. It happened on the 3rd day after I gave birth that this woman also gave birth to a child, and we were together. There was no stranger with us in the house, only the 2 of us in the house. This woman's son died in the night because she lay on it. So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead son in my bosom. When I arose in the morning to nurse my son, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him carefully in the morning, behold, he was not my son whom I had born. Then the other woman said, No, for the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son. But the first woman said, No, for the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son. Thus they spoke before the king. So here's Solomon. Has these 2 women come before him. They're arguing as to whose son is the one that's living, and whose son is the one that had died in the night. And so they tell the story, and they're arguing back and forth. No, this is my son that's living, and the other one says, no, it's my son that is living. But verse 23, here's what Solomon said. Then the king said, the one says, this is my son who is living, and your son is the dead one. And the other says, no, for your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one. The king said, get me a sword. So they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, divide the living child in 2, and give half to the one and half to the other. Then the woman whose child was the living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred over her son, and said, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him. But the other said, he shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him. Then the king said, give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother. When all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had handed down, they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. You think about this story, and again, this is one of the stories we're probably most familiar with in the life of Solomon. Is him here, the story here with the 2 women, and him using his wisdom here to determine whose the child really was. Imagine for a second being in Solomon's shoes as these 2 women come in, and you have one saying, this is my child, and the other says, no, but it's my child. And they're arguing back and forth. And as you're sitting there, the question is, whose child is it really? Is it this woman's child, or is it this woman's child? Whose child is it? And so for just a second, you sit back and again imagine being in the shoes of Solomon here. How do you determine whose the child really is? And so Solomon calls to them and says, bring a sword. Solomon calls for the sword so that he could do what? Divide the child. Solomon does not really intend to divide the child. Solomon knew that when he called for the sword, the one who was really the mother would not allow him to divide the child. That one would have such compassion that they would say, give him to the other woman, just as happens in this story, because of the compassion and love they had for their own child. So he calls for a sword, and as he calls for the sword and says, divide the child in 2, the one that is the mother of the child says, no, just give him to the other woman. She doesn't want to see any harm befall the child. But the other woman, the one whose child it is not, says, go ahead and divide him. Give half to me, give half to the other. Go ahead and divide him. He shall be neither mine, nor shall he be yours. So Solomon knows that when this takes place, this woman that's not showing compassion is not the child's mother. So Solomon uses his wisdom here to determine who the mother really is, by who was going to show the compassion and let the child live, and by which one was willing to let him divide the child. But look at verse 28. After, in verse 27, he gives the child to the one that is the mother of the child. In verse 28, all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had handed down, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. Now there's fear in the people. Why are the people fearing? They hadn't seen this they hadn't seen this before. They understand at this point, here is this, that the wisdom of God, as it says, is in him. He knows how to administer justice. So they greatly fear because of the justice that could be handed down. They're not really, you think about it, if you put it in this standpoint, go back to the story of the two women. The first woman, the woman that took the living child and brought it into her room, and took the dead child and took it into the other woman's room, probably thought she could get away with it. And then they go before King Solomon. She probably figured Solomon's never going to figure out who really the mother is. Again, if we were sitting here from a human standpoint, how are we going to determine who it is? How are we going to determine who the mother really is? We probably wouldn't have thought about bringing out a sword and saying, divide the child in two. How are we going to figure that out? But Solomon did. He figured that out. And now they fear, because of that, they fear knowing the wisdom of God is in him to administer justice. So the people feared the wisdom that he had received back here in verses 1 to 15. 1 Kings chapter 4 now. Let's go into 1 Kings chapter 4. 1 Kings chapter 4, the first 19 verses is a list of Solomon's officials. So here we just have a list of his officials. These are the officials. Azariah, the son of Zadok, was priest. Elithoreph and Ahijah, the sons of Shisha, were secretaries. Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was the recorder. And he goes on and lists here the positions that each of these people were holding in chapter 4. And for time's sake, we'll skip through that rather quickly, and let's go to the last half of chapter 4. Go to verse 20 now. 20 through 34, here's some talks about Solomon's wealth and his wisdom. Judah and Israel, verse 20, were as numerous as the sand that is on the seashore. In abundance, they were eating and drinking and rejoicing. Now Solomon ruled over the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all of his life. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. For he had dominion over everything west of the river, from Tiphsah even to Gaza, over all the kings west of the river, and he had peace on all sides around about him. So Judah and Israel lived in safety, every man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Those deputies provided for King Solomon and all who came to King Solomon's table each in his month. They left nothing lacking. They also brought barley and straw for the horses and swift steeds to the place where it should be, each according to his charge. Let's stop there for just a moment. We'll pick up in 39. Remember back in chapter 3, and we just saw this in chapter 3, when Solomon made his request for wisdom, God said, you didn't ask for these three things. What were the three things mentioned? Wealth, long life, and peace. Now, we know that the prolonging of days or the length of life was conditional back in chapter 3. But let's look at those other two. Let's look at peace and wealth. Look at what happens here in this chapter. Look at all the things that are provided for him. The Solomon's provision was 30 cores of flour and 30 cores of meal, and the 10 fattened oxen and the 20 pasture-fed oxen and 100 sheep, besides the deers, the gazelles, the roebucks, and the fattened fowl. It talks about how he had dominion over everything west of the river, from Tiphsah even to Gaza, over all the kings west of the river in 24. He had peace on all sides in verse 24. Look at verse 26. Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And those deputies provided for King Solomon all who came to Solomon's table each month. They left nothing lacking. So we see what was told here back in chapter 3. Here's what you could request that I will give to you as well. Here it lists that he has peace on all sides round about him. He has peace all around from his enemies. And not only does he have peace, he has great wealth. What we're seeing taking place here in chapter 4 is exactly what God said was going to take place. You're going to have wealth and you're going to have peace. And then if you serve me, you'll have length of days. Here's that wealth. Here's that peace. But Solomon requested, and we already saw this, Solomon requested wisdom. God had granted him wisdom, and we saw that in chapter 3 with the story that was told. But look now at verse 29. Now God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment and breadth of mind, like the sand is on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezphite, Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahal, and his fame was known in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He spoke also of all animals and birds and creeping things and fish. Men came from all peoples to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So we already saw here about the wealth and about the peace. But here is talking more about this wisdom of Solomon. His wisdom, he had this very great discernment and breadth of mind that was like the sand on the seashore, according to 29. It surpassed all the men of the sons of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt in verse 30. He was wiser than all men in verse 31. 32 talks about the fact that he spoke all these proverbs and wrote these songs. But it talks in verse 34, and it also talked about the end of verse 31, about in 31 that his wisdom, his fame became known to all of them because of his wisdom. It's to all the surrounding nations in verse 31. And in verse 34, it said that that men came from all peoples to hear the wisdom of Solomon. So here are all these people that have heard of the fame, heard of the great wisdom of Solomon, that come a long way to hear Solomon's wisdom. So we see here where the Lord has granted exactly what He told Solomon He would grant to him. He has given him peace, He has given him wealth, He has given him wisdom. And we see all those here in 1 Kings chapter 4, 20 through 34. Now, let's move on to 1 Chronicles chapter 28. Be turning to 1 Chronicles now. If you go back to 1 Chronicles, you'll notice as we go to 1 Chronicles 28 and 29, we're sort of going back in time for just a moment. Some things that took place to parallel some of the things we saw last week. And that is, if you remember, that Solomon has been made king in chapter 1, and in the beginning of chapter 2, David gives him some final instructions before his death. We come back to 1 Chronicles 28 until the very end of 29. David is alive in 1 Chronicles 28 and 29. So we're going back to some of the stuff that's taking place before. Beginning at verse 1 of chapter 28, we have David's address to the people of Israel. David assembled all Jerusalem and all the officials of Israel and princes of the tribes, and the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds, and the overseers of all the property and livestock belonging to the kings and his sons, with the officials and the mighty men, even all the valiant men. And so here David arose in verse 2 to his feet and said, "Listen to me, my brethren and my people. I had intended to build a permanent home for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God, so I had made preparations to build it. But God said to me, verse 3, you shall not build a house for my name, because you are a man of war and have shed blood. Yet the Lord, the God of Israel, chose me from all the house of my father to be king over Israel forever, for He had chosen Judah to be a leader. And in the house of Judah, my father's house, and among the sons of my father, He took pleasure in me to make me king over all Israel. Of all my sons," verse 5, "for the Lord has given me many sons. He has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. He said to me, your son Solomon is the one who shall build my house and my courts, For I have chosen him to be a son to me, and I will be a father to him. I will establish his kingdom forever if he resolutely performs my commandments, my ordinances, as is done now. So now in the sight of all Israel, the assembly of the Lord, and the hearing of our God, observe and seek after all the commandments of the Lord your God, so that you may possess the good land and bequeath it to the sons after you forever. And so David calls the people together to give one of his final addresses to the people of Israel, and he calls them together here, and he says, listen, the Lord has chosen Solomon to sit on the throne after me. He chose me from my father's house, and I desired to build a permanent dwelling for the ark of God, but the Lord told me no. But He's chosen Solomon to reign after me, and Solomon is the one to build this house for the Lord, for he told me that he would establish my kingdom forever if he resolutely performs my commandments and ordinances, as is done now in verse 7. And there seems to be a reference back here to in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the promise made to David. But David not only addresses the people here, David gives a farewell address, and recorded in more detail than in 1 Kings, to Solomon. Here's what he says. As for you, verse 9, my son Solomon, know the God of your father, and serve him with a whole heart and a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands every intent of the thoughts. If you seek him, he will let you find him. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. Consider now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be courageous and act. Then David gave to his son Solomon the plan of the porch of the temple, its buildings, its storehouses, its upper rooms, its inner rooms, and the room for the mercy seat. And the plan of all that he had in mind for the courts of the house of the Lord, for all the surrounding rooms, for the storehouses of the house of God, and for the storehouses of the dedicated things. And it lists here some of the stuff that David had that was in those plans. But I want you to notice in verse 9, David's instructions to Solomon. I think there's a couple of very important things that we need to learn from this. As David is telling Solomon, and again we saw this recorded in Kings, and is addressed to him here, that he needs to serve the Lord but he needs to serve him with two things. Number one, he needs to serve him with a whole heart. David is reminding Solomon that service to God is not something to be taken lightly. It's not something where you can half-heartedly give yourself in service to God and expect everything to be okay. This is something that requires service from a whole heart. And when you think about the Scriptures and what the Scriptures say concerning the service to God, that it talks about using a whole or all our heart in several occasions when it talks about our service to God. I think about in the book of Deuteronomy, as there's a lot of exhortations given there by Moses in his speech to them on the plains of Moab. Time and time again reminds them, love the Lord with all your heart, seek Him with all your heart, serve Him with all your heart, do His commandments, and He reminds them over and over again, do it with all or a whole heart. But not only does He tell him that he needs to serve Him with a whole heart, He also tells him what? With a willing mind. Part of wholehearted service, and this is the key going into this wholehearted service part, is first offering service with a willing mind. This is not something that Solomon needs to turn and offer to God because Solomon feels he has to serve God. It's not something where Solomon needs to turn and say, I feel compelled to serve God because I've been told that that's what I need to do. But this is something where he wants to serve God. He's willing to serve God. You see, you can't offer wholehearted service unless it's first willing service. If you're not willing to serve God, if you do it because you feel it's just something you have to do and not something that you want to give to God, a willing service, then you can't really offer wholehearted service. Because you can't serve with a whole heart because there's no really deep-rooted devotion, deep-rooted conviction within you if you're not doing so from a willing heart. So David's reminding Solomon, you need to serve God with a whole heart and with a willing mind. Because you pointed out that the Lord searches all hearts and understands every intent of the thoughts. You know, there are times, and I think about passages in the New Testament that makes a point about people that they pretended to be righteous, or they have a form of godliness. And in 2 Timothy chapter 3, some translations talk about those there that they have a form of godliness. And the Lord referred to the leaders of His day as pretending to be righteous. There are those that can put on that facade and be serving but be hypocrites. There are those that can make others think that they are truthfully seeking the Lord with a whole heart and with a willing mind. But David points out to Solomon that it's not just that you offer that to God. You offer it to God and remember that God knows if this is not really how you're serving Him. Solomon could have put on this facade and fooled all the people of Israel that he was serving God with a whole heart and a willing mind. They might have thought that Solomon was. But the Lord searches all hearts and understands every intent of the thoughts. So David is reminding Solomon here, if you don't offer wholehearted and willing mind service to God, the Lord will know. But if you seek Him, He will let you find Him. But if you forsake Him, He will reject you forever. If you're truthfully seeking the Lord, you can find Him. But if you turn away from God, then He will reject you. And so that's something that David wanted to remind Solomon of here. Offer to God wholehearted service with a willing mind. Understand the Lord knows if you're being hypocritical. He knows your intents of your heart. And understand if you truthfully seek Him, you will find Him. But if you forsake Him, He is going to reject you. And that's something that David wanted him to be reminded of in verse 9. Let's skip on down to verse 19 after we go through this list of stuff from the temple in 19. All this, verse 19, said David, the Lord made me understand in writing by His hand upon me all the details of this pattern. Then David said to his son Solomon, be strong and courageous and act. Do not fear or be dismayed, for the Lord God, my God, is with you. He will not fail you, nor forsake you until all the work for the service of the house of the Lord is finished. Now behold, there are the divisions of the priests and the Levites for all the service in the house of God, and every willing man of any skill will be with you in the work, in all the work for all kinds of service. The officials also and all the people will be entirely at your command. So he reminds him here, be strong, be courageous, and act. Do what needs to be done. The Lord will be with you while you do undertake this work. In 1 Chronicles chapter 29, the first 9 verses are some of these offerings taking place for the temple before they get to building it. But I want you to come down to verse 10 with me. 10 through 22a is David's prayer. David blessed the Lord in the sight of all the assembly. And David said, blessed are you, O Lord God of Israel, our Father forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. Indeed, everything that is in heaven and the earth, yours is the dominion, O Lord, and you exalt yourself as head over all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all, and in your hand is power and might, and it lies in your hand to make great and to strengthen everyone. Now, therefore, our God, we thank you and praise your glorious name. Now, as David begins this prayer here, as David's blessing the Lord in the sight of the assembly, he begins by by talking about God's greatness and His power and glory. He begins by praising God. He begins his prayer by pointing out that all these blessings they have come from God, that it's His greatness, He has the dominion, He exalts Himself head over all. So he thanks Him for that in verse 13, for all the things that you've blessed them with, but also praise His glorious name. Then he comes down to verse 14 and says, but who am I and who are my people that we should be able to offer as generously as this? For all things come from you, and from your hand we have given you. For we are sojourners before you and tenants, as all our fathers were. Our days of the earth are like a shadow, and there is no hope. O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided to build you a house for your holy name, it is from your hand, and all is yours. So David points out, we have all this that we've gathered together, all this offering brought together for the building of the temple. But in reality, Lord, it's all yours. You have blessed us, and now we're giving this back for the building of this temple for worship to you. But ultimately, we're just giving you back which you gave to us in the first place, for all is yours. And when we come down into verse 22b through verse 27, here's where Solomon's made king. And they made Solomon the son of David king a second time, and they anointed him as ruler for the Lord, and Zadok as priest. Then Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king instead of David his father, and he prospered, and all Israel obeyed him. And then 26 and 27 is a summary of David's rule. We saw this last week. He ruled 7 years at Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. And then we have the death of David recorded in 28 through 30. Now, 2 Chronicles chapter 1. In 2 Chronicles chapter 1, as we begin the reign of Solomon, 2 Chronicles 1 parallels very similarly both of our chapters over in Kings. 1 through 6 is Solomon coming to worship at Gibeon, where he comes to Gibeon, as it mentions in 1 Kings chapter 3. And then beginning at verse 7 and going through verse 13, here Solomon asks for wisdom. Where God is asking him, what would you have me give to you? He requests wisdom, and God said, because this was in your mind in verse 11, and you didn't ask for riches, wealth, or honor, or the life of those who hate you, nor have you even asked for a long life, but you have asked for yourself wisdom and knowledge, that you may rule my people over whom I have made you king. Then he tells him that he'll grant him that wisdom and knowledge, but all these other things as well. And then 14 through 17 talks about Solomon's wealth. This is very similar to what we saw over in 1 Kings chapter 4, where it talked about Solomon's wealth as well, as it listed the things that he had, where it talked about his wealth, his wisdom, and him having peace from his enemies. Now, we've gone through that rather quickly this evening, but let's talk about some practical lessons that we find in these chapters. What are some practical lessons we can learn from 1 Kings 3 and 4 and 1 Chronicles 28 through 2 Chronicles 1? Go ahead. It's a good point. The willing mind and the whole heart, but also that we're ultimately stewards. Right. The wholehearted service required him making the changes when he did make mistakes, as opposed to Saul, who never made any changes. Here's some practical lessons. I think we see the need for wisdom in this text. Solomon understood that. Again, as pointed out in Proverbs, David had instructed him on the importance of wisdom. Acquire wisdom, acquire understanding. He understood that, and so when the opportunity was presented to him, what would you have me give to you? He sought wisdom. We see the service for God needs to be with the whole heart. I think we see some of the blessings from serving God. There can be conditions upon our service to God, but there is blessings if we do serve God. For Solomon, the blessings would be here on this earth if he served God. And David points out to him that the Lord would be with him, and the Lord will be with us if we serve him here on this earth. Ultimately, the blessing will be in eternity, but there are blessings from serving God. And again, as that's pointed out to Solomon, there were some conditions there, but if you serve God, you can receive these blessings. But also, the fact that the Lord will not forsake us unless we forsake Him. The Lord is not going to leave us or forsake us, and that point was made to Solomon here. As long as you're serving God, God's going to be with you. If you forsake the Lord, then He will reject you. If you forsake the Lord, then He's not going to be there to be found by you. You've got to be willing to seek Him and find Him. But He's not going to leave or forsake you as long as you are doing your part in service to Him. And we see that as well in the conditions that are given, where it's told to Solomon, here I'll prolong your days if you serve me, if you keep my commandments. And so we can see the Lord's not going to forsake us unless we forsake Him. Next week we'll be in 1 Kings 5 and 6, and then 2 and 3 of 2 Chronicles.